My name's Dan Glazebrook, and the book's called Divide and Ruin, the West's Imperial Strategy in an Age of Crisis. My argument in the book is that we're actually in a kind of new phase now that's driven by the number of crises. We're not so much in a phase of divide and rule, so much as what I call the book Divide and Ruin. Because if you look at, during the Cold War, for example, or even before the Cold War, going to the kind of classic imperialist era in the 19th century, the European powers and later America as a kind of new imperialist power operated this divide and rule principle where they tried to control countries by making alliances with certain factions within the country. And what I think we're seeing now is that there are a number of crises affecting this kind of 500-year-old kind of imperial system, if you like, whereby it's difficult to control countries anymore. It's difficult to control them economically because you've got the rise of China. So Western financial institutions are really unable to, or at least unwilling, to compete with the kind of terms of trade offered by the Chinese. So you're seeing increasingly African countries going to China for finance, for mining, offering them mineral rights because the Chinese just offer far, far superior deals. So that means that Britain and US and France and these kind of old imperial powers are losing their kind of economic leverage. So this is one element of the crisis. And then on a military level as well, they're trying to turn to using their military because their economic power is declining. But the insurgencies in Afghanistan and Iraq have really crippled their military ability as well, and have really destroyed their capacity to wage long-term ground invasions and occupations. So this new strategy, I think, is they're accepting that they can no longer control powerful regional powers as they once could by propping up client states, people like Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Mobutu in the Congo. This kind of era is over because if they allow these strong states to exist, then their loyalty cannot be depended on. They're likely to turn to China, who offers better deals and so on. So divide and ruin is kind of trying to get across the idea that they're actually deliberately sowing divisions in countries in order to keep them crippled and to prevent anyone from coming to power. So if you look at what's happened to Iraq, to Libya, even to Syria to an extent, I don't think this is an accident that they've been turned into failed states effectively by NATO and their allies. This is, I think, their kind of plan B, that if they can't control these countries, then it's a kind of slash and burn policy. Well, we'll leave them a big failed state mess so that at least they're not acting as regional independent powers that are a counterweight to our influence, that ally with our enemy China, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a very real reality and a very dangerous development.
Now, it sounds a little bit similar to a few years ago we had Naomi Klein's book, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. I just wonder what you think the point of all this is. You can't actually use a country if it's in ruins. All you can do is deny it to others.
Yeah, that is effectively what I'm saying. I mean, I haven't read this book, Disaster Capitalism. I've read some of the things she's written in terms of articles, and my understanding is that what she's arguing, which I'd agree with, is that when there are disasters befalling a country, military invasions or whatever it is, when people are in a state of shock, that's used then as a kind of a way of ramming down those countries' throats, kind of neoliberal policies of total opening up of their economies to total exploitation by foreign companies and ending kind of public services and this kind of thing. And I agree with all that, but what I'm saying is kind of going beyond that. So I'm saying that it's also about, on the one hand, you're right, it's driven by the kind of desire to deny any possible rivals of Western capitalism the chance to develop relations with particular countries. But it's also driven by the other aspect of the crisis we haven't discussed yet, which is the financial economic crisis beginning in 2007 and 8, which in Marxist terms, I think you can see it as a classic what's called a kind of overproduction crisis, where one thing that this crisis economically is not about is a lack of money. And the problem, actually, if you look at the economics behind these kind of crises, is that there's too much money. The big corporations, the wealthy holders of capital, have huge amounts of cash, huge amounts of capital, and their problem is they have nowhere profitable to invest it. because the people they want to sell it to, in other words, the world's population, are too poor to basically buy the products that they want to sell. So this leads to what's called a kind of overproduction crisis. Factories get closed down because they can't sell their goods and so on, and this makes the problem worse, as then you have even more poor people kind of thrown on the scrap heap of unemployment, unable to buy goods, and it gets worse and worse. And I think what they're trying to do then, also another thing they're trying to do with destabilizing countries, is create markets for rebuilding countries. I mean, the kind of construction contracts in Libya, reconstruction, they completely bombed Libya. And then there was the new government that they imposed by force, then was allocating contracts worth $300 billion to reconstruct the country. So if you destroy countries, that creates one very profitable avenue for investment in rebuilding what you've just destroyed. And another element of, if you have a perpetual kind of failed state like Libya now at war of itself, no prospect of any viable security anytime in the future, what that means is rich people with assets to protect, they have to turn to private security for protecting their homes and their investments and their oil fields and these kinds of things. Those are the kind of services that were once provided by a state, in a failed state, have to be provided by private security. And who's the world leaders in providing private security? Britain and the US. They're losing their competitive edge in all other industries and technologies, but this is the one they remain world leaders, as well as the arms trade more generally, which of course also benefits from generalized insecurity. So I think it's also about creating markets to try and overcome this kind of financial and economic crisis as well, by making people have to pay their own private security companies for security indefinitely into the future, because there's no state capacity to provide security.
On the economic side, we've seen this week the BRICS countries talking about and actually taking the first proper steps towards setting up a competitor, really, to the World Bank. Does that mean that the Bretton Woods system that was set up after World War II has failed? Because the idea was that this was a world system, and many countries around the world are saying actually that is broken too. I wonder if you just talk about, if you think it's broken, and if so, why?
Well, absolutely, you're right in saying this is a rival to the World Bank and the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, which includes the International Monetary Fund. And this is only, and I don't think that, the IMF is not going to be finished off by this, but what it's going to have to do, and the World Bank is also going to have to do, which is a good news by any standard, is going to have to really up its game to compete for business. It's going to have to actually start offering, something other than just indefinite growing debt to people. If you look in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Cold War, but before the kind of rise of China really massively took off, that was the era when International Monetary Fund really had the monopoly, and Western financial institutions really had the monopoly on providing loans and finance to governments around the world. And that was a disaster, because they really used that power, that monopoly power that they had, to really turn the screw on already heavily indebted, poverty-stricken countries across Africa and Asia and so on. And so they would make conditions, this era of what we call the structural adjustment programs, where governments who needed loans, and they were usually loans, by the way, to pay off earlier debts with very extortionate interest rates that had been lent by the same institutions. Then their conditions for providing these loans would be, crippling for the countries. There'll be things like, you have to remove all subsidies for your farmers, remove all subsidies for your industry. So whole swathes of industry and farming were destroyed. You have to remove tariffs, that is taxes on foreign imports. So places were flooded with cotton or rice, and all of those cotton and rice farmers put out of business and so on. These structural adjustment policies led to a massive growth in the kind of slum population, really, as farmers forced off their land, people thrown out of work and so on. It was really devastating time. Public spending cut, the AIDS epidemic grew massively throughout this period because people had to cut back on their education programs, health education, healthcare.
So let me interrupt you, because why has it taken so long for a competitor to the World Bank and the IMF, since it's caused such devastation right across the developing world?
Well, in a sense, there was a competitor before. There was the Soviet Union, which was, which would provide engineers and healthcare workers and so on to countries around the world. So it was just, there was this kind of blip really in the 90s, before China really became, China's had this policy for a long time of kind of trying to rise without really anyone noticing. So they've avoided doing anything that might be seen as kind of provocative or trying to muscle in the West field. They're very nervous about kind of creating enemies unnecessarily, if you like. But I think now that, we've gone beyond that. And, US is openly now, with this pivot to Asia, so-called, openly, basically trying to surround and intimidate China. And I think they're thinking, well, it's kind of a bit late for like keeping our nose down and hoping no one notices we're here. So we may as well do something useful. And they've already been effectively acting as a kind of banker in a sense, even before the official BRICS Bank was set up. In terms of the business deals they've been doing in places like Africa, providing infrastructure in the form of housing, hospitals, healthcare centres, universities, in exchange for mining concessions and so on across Africa and so on. So they have been, and they have, an export-import bank and a development bank of their own that helps facilitate these deals and provide finance in these deals. So it's not completely new. It's actually the outcome of an ongoing development that China's been a leading part of.
It's quite frustrating and depressing seeing our own taxpayers' money and our politicians, people we vote for, causing this chaos across the world, causing massive destitution. Do you think that there is any light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely positive in all this. The thing we have to bear in mind, like when I say that the West is in a kind of in a phase where it's destroying and devastating country after country, adopting a kind of slash and burn policy of destroying countries so they can't function as independent regional powers. What we have to bear in mind, yes, of course, that's all very depressing, but it's driven by what is essentially a very positive development in the world, which is the declining ability of the West to continue to extort resources from the rest of the world. And this system is this 500-year-old kind of system, way of doing business that Europe and then North America have developed, of really extorting and exploiting the rest of the world to facilitate their own growth and development. This is what's really under threat now, and this is what's actually driving these desperate policies of what I call divide and ruin. So we mustn't forget that this is a very positive development, one that should be supported, the decline of Western manipulation and extortion around the world. And what they're trying to do is kind of claw back some of their influence with these policies. So obviously that makes it a very dangerous time. If you look at the Nazis were at their most dangerous after Stalingrad, after the balance had tipped, after they started losing the war. That's when they started adopting literal slash and burn policies. Nevertheless, that was driven by the fact they were losing the war, and that was good. And that's the same situation we're in today. We're moving towards a multipolar world, and that's a good development. And what we in Western countries need to really focus on is understand that's a good development, not be driven towards a kind of fascistic type mindset which tries to claw back the kind of old privileges, but instead not allow the decline of West to be only taken out on the poor, which is what our government's trying to do now, is to say, okay, well, the West's in decline, therefore no one can have any public services anymore, etc. No, we need to reorganize Western societies, accept that it's not fair that the West should dominate the rest of the world, accept that we want a more equal world, and that's a good thing, and that's a just thing. And we need to reorganize our societies in a way that they don't depend on exploiting the rest of the world, and that actually the rich are taxed fairly, and that we reorganize our society in a way that copes and contributes to this positive development, moving towards more global equality and justice, rather than trying to claw back old privileges and things like that.
The trouble is we live in a nuclear age, don't we? And the Western powers, the Europe and the United States, the NATO powers, are almost like a kind of cornered animal. They're extremely powerful. They're starting to lose. Is there not the possibility they might lash out?
They are lashing out, and you're absolutely right. So, like I say, although there's the positive element, it's when they become at their most dangerous, when these powers are in decline as well. So, yeah, absolutely, we need to be very wary, very careful, especially with what's happening in places like Ukraine. I mean, the West has been acting appallingly in Ukraine. US and Britain have basically supported a coup there, led by fascist militias. They then encouraged that coup government to integrate those fascist militias into a new national army called the National Guard, which they're unleashing against any resistance to that coup. And that's what we're seeing playing out in Ukraine right now, all the time, whilst accompanying it with a sort of crescendo of anti-Russian propaganda. This is all very dangerous developments. So absolutely, these things go hand in hand. When a powerful, exploitative ruling power is in decline, that's a positive development, but it's a dangerous development as well. So we do need to be careful.
Well, that was a masterly explanation of the current geopolitical balance of forces, Tony.
Also, this biggie this week, isn't it? The Global Development Bank. Do you think it's going to work or not?
It's bound to work in the end, but as he says, the declining Western powers are determined to try and frustrate it.
OK, time to sign off. Time for the Murdoch News at 7 now. Thanks very much, Jake.